Hi, everyone, and welcome back to How the Wise One Grows. So, our number one episode on the podcast so far was episode 102 about the decision to have kids or remain child-free with Kelty McGuire. And after that conversation was released, I got a little bit of feedback from listeners that it veered on the child-free side. So I decided that we should dive deeper into this conversation around what happens if and when you step into the role of caregiver or parenthood and how it transforms you with Elissa Strauss. Elissa Strauss is the author of When You Care, The Unexpected Magic of Caring for Others. She is a journalist, essayist, and opinion writer, and contributes to publications like the New York Times, The Atlantic, Glamour, and more. She's been a contributing writer for CNN, where she covered the culture and politics of parenthood, as well as for Slate, where she wrote on feminism and motherhood. Elissa and I had this conversation about the importance of caregiving and what happens when you care the day after the 2024 presidential election. And it honestly left me feeling so much more empowered and supported than when we started the conversation. I think it's a really important conversation to be having, and care is important now more than ever. So I am so excited to share this conversation with you. But before we get started, let's take a moment to land here together with a deep breath. So notice where your body makes contact with the earth, and take a big breath in and a big breath out. Elissa, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Do you mind sharing a bit about your background and relationship with care? I have been obsessed with your book, When You Care. So I feel like I know a little bit through that, but I would love for listeners to just get a bit of your background and relationship with care.
So my primary care experience of my life, with a few exceptions, is caring for my two sons who are now 12 and 7. I had my 12-year-old in 2012, and I lived in Brooklyn, New York at the time. And as I talk about in my book, I was not ambivalent about having kids. That part felt to me like something I clearly wanted to do. But I was very ambivalent about how much of like a mom TM kind of to be, how much to let motherhood in as part of who I am, how I view the world. And at the time, and I think in many ways the conversation shaped and grown, but there's still some of this. There was a real sense that like it's a risk for a woman to have kids because like if we don't, actively resist, like the care will kind of swallow us whole. It'll take over our identities. It'll take over, even if it's not our identities, practically speaking, it'll take over our lives. So I really thought I could kind of create a vision of the world in which I could have the kid, but not let that happen. And what happened to me is that I found out through caring for Augie, my firstborn, turned on probably around age 2 when he really started talking. It wasn't a love at first sight or like epiphany at first sight experience at all. But as my relationship with Augie really took off, I realized that like I was really diminishing care in my life. I had thought that it was something that if it takes over, quote unquote, you lose yourself to it, or it takes over your identity, that's a loss, right? That's a bad thing.
Yeah.
And for years, I wrote so much about why we don't have paid leave and universal, affordable, and reliable childcare, elder care, why maternity care stinks in this country. So I was always angry at the world for not valuing care. And it took me, honestly, a couple of years of parenting to realize that like I myself wasn't really valuing care. I myself wasn't really curious about care as this experience, not for everyone, not so, and not certainly not everyone has to do it to become a more insightful or better person, but it is actually a path to wisdom. For me, it really was a path to epiphany. I did so many epiphany seeking things, in my 20s before I had kids, meditation retreats and psychedelics and hiking tall mountains. And those are all beautiful experiences. And I'm so glad we live in a time where women can do those things. And if a woman chooses to dedicate herself to those things and not have kids, great. I have absolutely no problem. I am not here with a pro-natalist agenda. I'm just here to say that I think our culture has a real blind spot to the kind of spiritual, philosophical, psychological, intellectual depths of care. And I myself had it as a feminist mom, having her first kid in 2012. And I would like to help us see that and help us understand care as not just a burden, not something that swallows your identity, not something that makes you boring and dull, but actually can be a truly expansive experience.
I feel like you talking about that feels like all of my thoughts around motherhood and care, or like the fears that I've had going into it. Um, and that was like a really big part of what sparked this conversation. In that Kids Are Child Free episode, I shared that like my biggest fear of becoming a parent is like losing myself in motherhood, and like feeling like once I have a child, if I have a child, like I will be doing that all the time. A lot of what you're saying, like that your identity goes into that. And I heard from other listeners a lot about what you were saying of like how it's not exactly like that. Um, and I kind of want to share a bit of one clip of what a listener said just to kind of reflect on that. But to me, it's really seemed that there is this myth of losing yourself in motherhood. So I'm so excited to dive into like what is on the other side of that coin, and how care is kind of at the root of that, and that framing in the way we think about parenthood. Because I know so many people who hold a similar sentiment. So this is what one listener had to share.
So I wanted to just comment on this idea of losing yourself in motherhood and suggest that perhaps lost or not lost is sort of a false dichotomy, that there's a great space in between that's powerful for change and growth and transformation if we can get beyond our sort of cultural idea that we're supposed to get back to our pre-baby self as quickly as possible. Um, I know for me, when my children were small, it felt very right to be close to them a lot of the time, and being with them and watching them and really just observing them and learning how to care for them felt more powerful and more important than doing the practices or the activities that had brought me joy and grounding and a sense of identity in my pre-child world. And I think I heard someone say once, let yourself be lost. And I think there's a real wisdom in that leaning into this new human and the process of caring for them can be an agent of change and growth for the parents. For me, when my youngest was 2, I felt much more able to sort of begin to integrate my pre-baby self and my post-baby self into this latest version of who I am. But that's a slow and ongoing process that took time.
I'm just kind of curious, like based off of your experience, how did that shift kind of unfold? Like you it sounded like for you, and maybe similar to this listener, like early on, maybe it did feel really immersed in like this is the chapter I'm in right now. It's just like so demanding in all of these ways that maybe you do get a little like quote unquote lost, but then maybe lost is more an evolution. What was that experience like for you?
I love the way she framed it, or at least my
Mm-hmm.
interpretation of the framing, because it's a really wonderful and rich distinction, right? Like the fear is losing yourself to parenthood, to motherhood, right? This idea that like it's irrevocable, like forever you will just lose yourself. Like that's a loss, right? Losing yourself when you lose yourself to motherhood.
Mm-hmm.
Versus being lost in motherhood can actually be this very generative, expansive time. And it's a difference of losing your favorite sweater, right? You left it at the airport, you're never getting it back. You've tried forever to call lost and found, clearly not happening. It's lost, right? Or you're in a forest and like you have, that you have a sense of like, I don't really know where I am, but I can see where the sun is and I have time and I'm going to make my way back and I can just enjoy that aliveness we feel when we don't quite know where we are, right? When we travel to a different city and we're walking around and we're just hitting the streets and we're not following Google Maps. And when we have to find our way back to our hotel, we'll get there. But just that, like sometimes being lost is a beautiful, expansive thing. Hard and challenging and stressful for sure when it comes to motherhood and particularly new motherhood. So I'm just actually in love with that right now. Like the difference between losing yourself and being lost, and one being kind of a done deal and a closure, and the other actually having these expansive possibilities. I think for me, well, I guess I'll start here because, my kids are 12 and 7 now. And I think so often the motherhood conversation gets kind of framed as the first 6 months or the first year, maybe the first couple years. And understandably so. That's the time of just like deep transition as someone becoming a mom. It's a time when children's needs are so demanding. I always say like my favorite stage and moment in transition period and parenthood is when I could like turn my back away from my kids and I didn't worry about them killing themselves. Like that is a liberation moment. So I think, it's I'm just trying to both remember what it's like to have that baby, to really go back to that time while also honoring that it's such a long story, motherhood, right? At least to 18, if not, of course, much longer. So to go back to the early parenthood phase, I think for me, in many ways, my fortress I built for myself where I would have a kid but not let motherhood ruin me, protected me. Many ways it actually allowed me to enter that more expansive generative place, because as part of my I'm not losing myself to this thing, I resisted a lot of the cultural pressures that are put on moms.
How did you do that? What was that resistance like for you?
I just was like, this is the patriarchy. I honestly, unfairly so. I probably wrote too many mean blog posts about doulas. I wasn't that nice. This wasn't fair. I just want to be clear, but there was part of that was protective for me. So I was very decided, I'm not going to do this attachment parenting thing. I'm not going to do natural childbirth. I'm going to just make this as easy for myself as possible. I'm not going to go to mommy and me classes or go to mothers groups. I just want to clarify again, I don't think that I got this totally right. And I know a lot of friends had beautiful support from their mothers group. So this is not an endorsement, but there was the silver lining that I just opted out of competition and fear and anxiety around whose kid is speaking first. Am I losing weight fast enough? I just told myself that is the page. I lumped everything into the patriarchy and I was angry at it and I closed the door on it. And I think today's version of that would be I wouldn't be on Instagram. I wouldn't be caring if I was the perfectly quote unquote gentle parent. I wouldn't be maybe I'd make my own baby food because sometimes honestly it was really cheap and easy with the immersion blender, but I wouldn't be putting all those pressures on myself. So I really had the sense that's all the patriarchy. And through that, I was devaluing care and devaluing community. But there's all the patriarchy. I'm making this easy for myself. So I think that, again, it was a double-edged experience, but it really helped me find my own way and toss aside a lot of the cultural scripts that I think can feel really heavy for women. And can be
I
really
think that's like a
toxic.
part of the resistance of it too, is like you just feel like it's being forced on you in this way where you're like, well, let me decide what I actually do and don't want. And yeah, just that like forcing of you makes you want to like push away. So I definitely understand that
Totally.
aversion.
So I think what I realized was like I kind of threw, and this is, a funny metaphor, but the baby out with the bathwater. Like I kind of realized that I was like rejecting this whole like right oppressive being pushed on us vision of care, but in the process I was also still diminishing care. So then I was like,
Yeah.
I had, I as like I said, my son really started talking, and I had, it sounds so obvious, but it's still such a deeply like philosophical reckoning when you realize that other people are different than you. And it's something we all struggle with, I think, our whole lives, right? Like really trying to encounter the other, to really trying to see and understand the other and not impose our own subjective experience on
Mm-hmm.
this other. It's the work of a lifetime. I don't think anyone will ever master it, but
Yeah.
it is essential for human connection. And there was something for me about being in this deeply like dependent, ongoing care connection with my son, where he just relied on me in so many ways, that really forced me to have a deep encounter with another in a way that
Mm.
honestly I had never done through friendships or through romantic relationships. And so it's around that time I realized, I was like, all right, I'm still not like breastfeeding till age 3. Again, if it works for you, beautiful. I'm post all that,
Yeah.
but I'm not going to get caught up in this like version of motherhood that I feel like would really hold me back professionally or dictate who I'm supposed to be friends with or anything like that. But that doesn't mean that there's not something here,
Yeah.
that there's not something actually so potent in motherhood. And I guess I see a lot of the work of my book, or at least my effort, is to try to like detangle motherhood from the patriarchy. Like
Mm.
not buy into the kind of patriarchal, sentimental vision of motherhood where it's like beautiful and easy and it's a woman's destiny. And if you don't want to
Mm-hmm.
do it, something's wrong with you. And if you're struggling with it, then again, something's wrong with you. You should, if you
Mm-hmm.
need support, something's wrong with you. Like get rid of that. Um, imagine a world where women can still, work in care and have active, free, creative lives in care. Like I'm in the both camp. And we take a little bit of what I see coming often from more traditional patriarchal cultures of like the real, like seeing care as this deeply sacred experience, and seeing
Mm-hmm.
care, maybe if we don't use the language of sacredness, but it is an expansive experience as an opportunity for growth. And it's like, I'm greedy. I am greedy in this way. And I want us to have both. I want women's true liberation. And we're still fighting for that, as we know. And I want us to see care in all its fullness.
Yeah. I find that to be like such a beautiful kind of juxtaposition that you hold in your book, and I love that you're speaking to that here, because it does on some level feel like okay, I have to like push this away to be like, all right, no to the patriarchy and the all of these oppressive things. And we can also have, there is so much expansion and beauty and depth, and like before when you were explaining like getting lost, it almost sounds like going on like a deep hike or like a mecca of some sorts, and we don't
Yeah.
have to close ourselves off from that either. Like almost pushing it away is like serving maybe some of what the patriarchy wants too. Like how can it be an immersive experience that we define and is entirely
Right.
our own? um and something that someone sent in that I want to touch on, and just like speaking to motherhood a little bit more before we dive into care as a whole, is with that, I feel like for my generation, and so many women, there's like this pressure to do it all. Like now it's not only should you like take care of the family, and my friends who are moms right now, TikTok and Instagram are just like
making their minds spin with all the things like, oh my gosh, I'm ruining my child if I'm not doing X, Y, and Z all the time. It just seems so overwhelming. So there's like such pressure, so much information out there about all the shoulds that you should be doing. And then on top of it, there's like, for me, I'm like, yeah, I want to work. Like, I want to be me. I want to be full. I want to like have all these other things too. So I want to share one clip from a listener that touches on that to hear your perspective.
So one story or narrative I've kind of told myself about motherhood is that I will still be able to be, do, and have it all. So I'll be able to be this very present mother who's able to make the lunches as well as kind of grow and succeed in my corporate career, and then have, all this self-care and me time and clean house. And I just feel like, another kind of narrative that's kind of been more prevalent and coming to light is just like, hey, that might be pretty toxic to think that you have to be and do it all. And I'm just really interested in like, how do we set really realistic expectations for ourselves going into this new phase of motherhood, especially considering that, we don't know how we're going to handle things or how we're going to be, and things might shift. And I think, especially for someone who's very driven and has high expectations for themselves and a pretty much, aggressive goals for where they want to be in their life, what's really realistic and how do we set ourselves up for success?
Yeah, so just kind of like sitting with that note of like, how do we not like put even more on our plates by being like, oh, I'm going to be the woman who does it all? Because there is a point where it is too much, and that's not a weakness, How can we fill our cups and care and do all of these things?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the first big note, and I'm sure will not come as news to you or your listeners, right, is there's structural problems. There's structural problems that make us stressed out, and we perceive them as individual weaknesses, right? We need the collective to help us care well for our children or whoever else we're caring from. We cannot care on our own. So, but when we buy into the myth that care is something that's small and simple, the picnic, with the gingham blanket version of care, we're like, yeah, we should be able to do this on our own and do everything else, because the patriarchy tricked us into thinking care is this like small, sweet thing instead of this like big, fleshy, messy, challenging experience. And as such, does not give parents or caregivers adequate support. So I think we need to think structurally. I think that's the first thing. Like, do we have paid leave for every parent in this country? Is paternity leave standard? Because let me tell you, with one baby, my husband didn't have paid leave, and the other he did, and that was night and day. If I was like, I had a Word document, I would just be like bolding, underlining, italicizing, exclamation points. Like, I cannot overemphasize how fundamentally different it was. And to think that he didn't have it with the first kid too. I really could have used him more with the first kid. Because that's the one where you're really like, I might kill this baby. I might kill this baby. The second one, you're like, they're probably not going to die. So like, right. So much of this is structural, and so much of this requires like deep political change. And then I think it is, it's an encounter with your own value system. It's an encounter with your own identity. There's that piece too. Listen, again, my career is super important to me. I basically never, especially because I'm freelance, so I never had paid leave. I started working again, not full time, but around when both of my kids were 6 years old. So like, I'm not here saying motherhood's great and that's the only thing women should do. That's not my MO at all. My MO is that it requires a lot of big questions you're asking yourself. Hopefully you have a partner that's sharing the care with you. I will put a plug in for my friend Eve Rotsky and her fair play method, because so much depends on having someone to share care with if we are someone with a partner. And you have those conversations with the partner, you find systems that work in your household, you ask yourself questions about like, what does ambition look like for me right now? And honestly, you can make it work. I have to say, I think there's I think if you find your way to answering these questions honestly for yourself of what does it mean to be a present parent, what does it mean to be an ambitious professional, like you're not going to probably get to do everything all the time, but you can find your way to a workable system. And in a way, I know a lot of people that are big advocates for working moms, while they really do appreciate the emphasis on how hard it is to get that structural policy, whether government or workplace change happening, they're also a little wary of it, because when we only focus on how absolutely impossible it is to be a working mom, a mom shows up to a job interview, a mom is, out for a promotion, it's going to feed into implicit bias. And those moms are going to be less likely to get that job or get that promotion or be put on this project that they've been like dying to work on forever, but is a little more demanding and people will think they can't do it. So, it's as much as, right, we hear about this burden, we hear how hard it is. I know so many working moms are like, it's not that hard. We're good. I got this. Like, let me, don't hold me back at work because you think that I'm totally falling apart.
Yeah.
And then I think like the last piece of this is really just, I don't know how to really get this into people's heads, but like, you don't have to do what the Instagram influencers are telling you to do. Like to the degree that I've researched child psychology, like they don't need one type of parent speaking in one type of voice. This year I heard about boo baskets for the first time. I mean, these, like every year there's something else that we're supposed to make our kids like gift baskets for Halloween. I mean, it's like, you really can opt out. I mean, I opt out. I love my kids. My kids actually, after a hard, long day, often restore me, like snuggle time at night, even if they drove me nuts, for 2 hours that night. Snuggling in their bed like centers me and calms me. It's just body to body. This is biochemical. So like that's the stuff that matters. Like, is there moments of joy and connection? Like, are you giving them some structure because they need a little? Like, that's it. That's the job. You don't need the boo basket. You don't need to be a gentle parent. I am not a gentle parent, So I think it's right, the structural piece, the remembering that actually there's many, many super awesome working moms right there that are able to find a way to make it work. And then remembering that so much of what's presented as somehow like necessary or ideal in terms of parenting approaches is just crap. I mean, it may work for some, but this idea that there's one size fits all for everyone, that is crap. Like, you find your own way. You're your own person. Your child's their own person. This is a absolutely unique and rare combination of humans in the world. Like, you find your own way.
Yeah, so it really sounds to me like you're saying with like on all fronts in terms of like how you choose to parent, how you choose to move through your career, like all of these things that become about like defining what that means for you, like defining what kind of parent you want to be and what that looks like, what works for you, not receiving anyone else's like shoulds and taking out your choice instead on those areas. And I think the part that I'm really looking forward to diving into too is how important community and like systems of support are around this and how much lack there is. So just like sitting with that, I guess like first, like from your perspective, what is care? What does it mean to care? And then how can we, especially, I mean, we're recording this the day after the election, when our politicians aren't supporting care, when the systems are around us aren't supporting care, and the people who care, how do we make a shift towards supporting one another in care and creating these systems of support for ourselves and one another?
So many good questions. I think for me, care is, in its like purest, simplest sense, it's kind of like active love, right? It's active affection. It's active awareness that we are all vulnerable, dependent human beings who need to be seen and in some capacity protected by others. So I think care is everywhere. And I think cares in our friendships, and I think cares in our schools and in our hospitals, particularly with nurses, right?
I
In my
think that's
book,
like so important to name too, because we isolate it towards parenthood often in our minds. But when we're
yeah,
expanding it to the broader community, I think it does help see how necessary it is in all aspects of our lives.
yeah, it's the glue, I mean, of
Mm-hmm.
humanity. And it's not, it's been so sentimentalized, this kind of kumbaya, isn't it nice thing. And to me, that totally like denies care its might, because care is tricky and it's hard. And navigating, whether it's your child or your friend, or someone you work with, navigating that piece of like, I love this person, I do have some obligation, but I don't want to fully like give everything to them, I need
Mm-hmm.
boundaries. That is like truly, truly the hardest thing a human can figure out over the course of their life, right? To really figure out how to protect the self, have those boundaries, be someone who craves freedom and autonomy, and also just like quiet and no one
Mm-hmm.
complaining about dinner, just like from the little
Yeah.
to the big, right? And someone who is a social animal, who craves connection, needs connection, who has a sense of obligation that's beautiful, right? I think obligation, because it's often processed through a really patriarchal lens that oppresses women, like we can be a little twitchy about it, and I get it,
Yeah.
but obligation is also just a beautiful part of being human. We are wired, in fact, to get like nice hits of dopamine when we meet someone with like this active, a kind of active love fueled by a sense of obligation. We're glad that our parents feel obligated to us. We are glad that our partners and friends feel a sense, and it's not such a dirty word, right? So these are things that are really make humanity work. These are, if you look at evolutionary science, this isn't the side dish and competitions like the main, force behind the survival of the human species. Like this sense of sympathy, empathy, connection, and care is absolutely essential for us. Tricky, thorny, complicated. Again, it doesn't mean no one's happily ever after, but care is right in there. And so I think, yeah, we have to really see, like, just like name it and make it visible as part of it. Like, see that so much of what we do and who we are happens through care. It would not happen otherwise. And so there's kind of this bigger care. But in my book, I was really curious about a specific type of care, which is, like as I kind of, we'll put the shorthand version of it is like relationships you can't just leave. like you have a kid, maybe you can, but
Mm-hmm.
there's a big
Mm-hmm.
social cost or stigma. These are ongoing dependency relationships. So this isn't a teacher or a nurse, and this probably isn't your average friendship. This is when someone is really truly dependent on you to survive and perhaps thrive. And if you left them, that would have really negative consequences. It doesn't mean you can never leave. And I included paid caregivers in this as well, because they do, well, even though it's not the same and they can leave their job, they do have ongoing dependency relationships with the people they care
Yes.
for. I spoke to nannies, I spoke to home healthcare aides. This woman, June, who's in my philosophy chapter, a Jamaican woman who works as a home healthcare aide in the United States and has held, I think it's maybe 5 people's hands as they died. So that's some thick care right there. So I included paid caregivers, and I also included parents and family and friend caregivers to old, ill, and disabled individuals, and really just trying to see what the experience of having someone depend on us does to us. Like that was my
Mm.
big question after I had my big aha moment of realizing, like, oh, okay, I have bought in to this notion that care is kind of a small, simple thing, when in fact it's this big, messy, transformative thing. And now I want to know more, and I want to understand what it does to us.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. And I think that when you're talking about like getting deeper into care and finding this distinction between like the self and the other and like how that line becomes really blurred, I think can dive us into a bit of how it can become a really spiritual thing, because it kind of extends beyond logic a bit. And I think it shows this like great interdependence with one another and something maybe deeper within ourselves as well.
Yeah, and I think right now, if you spend time in kind of social TikTok and Instagram, social media, psychology and therapy circles, we see so much talk about boundaries, right? We see so much talk about fear of codependency, of being overly entangled with others. And I really do understand why. Women were expected to just kind of be there no matter what for so long. And we want to now protect ourselves from people just expecting us to give without ever getting anything in return. But on the other side, like, there is this loneliness crisis. People are deeply isolated. I took a Pilates class the other day, and at the end, this teacher does kind of what yoga teachers do, right? Is give almost like a little sermon at the end, which I like. But
yeah,
I found it so fascinating because she was basically giving us freedom. She said, do not worry what other people think about you. Do not worry about their expectations of you. And I get why that's liberating for a woman, but also there's a point where the correction can become an overcorrection. And if I'm really living my life, not worrying what other people think about me, if I'm living my life only concerned with setting up boundaries, I'm going to lose something. I mean, I'm probably going to be depressed because because humans are social creatures. And I think that it's also like, to make it so simple that we either give everything or give nothing is kind of a cop out, because I think, again, the hard work of being human is finding yourself in that messiness. And it's a constant adaptation. One of my favorite philosophers of care talks about this as a dance, right? You're constantly, if you're the parent, maybe you're kind of, guiding your child / dance partner. You're constantly responding to the moment. So there's no one fix, one answer to the eternal complexity that is human connection and care. But we do have to arrive, I think, with more curiosity than simply saying, I don't care what other people think about me. I just need to create boundaries. And we got to go beyond that and be like, all right, I do need boundaries, but I also need connection. And humans are fundamentally dependent species. So I can try to have all these boundaries all I want, but probably someone's going to need me during their life, whether or not I have kids, by the way, like your parent or friend, like most of us will find. And like, I'm going to need someone else during my life. I probably will get sick. So we got to take it. I think it's time to take it that next step beyond the endless giving, beyond the boundaries, and find that place where we're just realizing, like, this is hard work. This is what I got to do, but this is also essential.
Yeah, it almost sounds like that overcorrection space again. It's like, okay, we've been told we need to give all the time. Now we're saying just like no is a complete sentence. Or right. Like kind of that same switch too of like, okay, we need to be in the home tending to this and that all the time, to like, okay, now I'm going to do all of it, like be super mom or like push away all the mom things and like no space for the in between. But I think what you're saying really reminded me of, there was this We Can Do Hard Things episode that was kind of talking about that boundaries and that like no is a complete sentence. And they were saying like, well, when you say instead like no to something and then you say your why, like I'm actually just like really drained right now, but like could you ask me again in a week? Or like I just don't like activities that are with a bunch of people, but I would love to go on a walk with you at another time, or something like that. You're actually like deepening connection, but you're also like, you are holding a boundary in a way that's like, hey, this is like what I need, what nurtures me, and what's my capacity. And I would still like to connect with you. Like I'm not just shutting things off. And it's had me thinking a lot about, I was with a group of women and we did like a parts work meditation where we talked about we focused on the part of ourselves that felt grounded. and then the part of ourselves that felt whatever heavy emotion was there, you know, your shadow part, the part that felt depleted or whatever, and you just went back and forth between the two. And what kind of came up was that, like, over time, the part of you that felt grounded could share its capacity with the part that needed support. And then that kind of like mirrored the web of like the people and the women in the circle of like, we can share our capacity with one another, and it doesn't make us any weaker. It makes like the whole of us stronger. So if like I'm having a shit day and I need support, I can reach out to a friend and get that support. And then I'm feeling stronger. That person, if they were in capacity to give, they're feeling good too. And then it can continue and we can grow. And I think that like that kind of like web of support and sharing capacity and knowing our true capacity and be able to communicate it has to be, or could be, a really key part of how we can have better care systems and how that can start within ourselves and our small communities and then expand.
Yeah. And I think like kids need us to model that for them. It's not just, you know, we have to do it because we get tired, right? Or burnt out.
Yeah.
It's actually good for them. First of all, it models knowing yourself and models being honest with yourself about your feelings, but it also actually helps them really trust your care. Like it becomes more authentic when you're honest about the moments that you're just not up for it in some way or the other. And I think that this idea that we have to protect our kids from the moments when we're not feeling up to it is like, I mean, it's part of this oppressive version of motherhood, right? That I think we can opt out of. I really do. That we're supposed to constantly be available, that we're supposed to constantly be talking to them when they're like, right, you have to just constantly be on. I think that my understanding of child psychology, and certainly my experience with kids, is kids, they would rather have authentic you than performative you. And authentic you is going to run out of battery juice sometimes. That it's like, so these things aren't like unfortunate parts, right, of parenting kids. They're actually necessary parts of parenting kids.
Thank you for that. When you look at like care in our society, what do you feel like is lacking the most? Like what do you feel like we need to focus on most moving forward?
I think I can't pick one. It's like asking to pick a favorite
or
kid.
many. You can tell me all.
Yeah. Between the structural change and the cultural change, and I think they're connected. And my book is a culture change book. I'm not, at the end of the day, I'm a humanities gal and a soul-seeking, human more than I am a white paper policy human. But we need that structural change. We need to understand that to have profound experiences with care, we cannot be totally burnt out by it. And right now we're living in a system that makes it so easy to get burnt out by it. So I already ran down my list. I'll do it one more time, but we need universal paid leave. We need universal, affordable, reliable, and flexible. The flexible piece is important because I think you should get paid to stay home with your kid, or you should have a nice childcare center that doesn't cost your monthly rent to send the child to. It's the flexibility is key. We need better maternity care. We need things like public spaces that aren't just built for able-bodied adults. This is such a huge, huge issue when you have a kid and you realize suddenly just the public's not for you anymore. Whether you can't wheel a stroller around, whether people give you also stink eye because you dared to bring your child to like a supermarket. It's like, like the public should be for everyone, not just, for, again, able-bodied adults. So we need workplaces to understand that human dependency is an eternal reality and accommodate their employees accordingly. And there's been a lot of movement in that. It's not impossible. Like you can get your work done and be a present caregiver as long as your management is seeing that and structuring the workflow accordingly. And then, let's jump to the cultural change piece, because for me, this is just as important. And I think the culture change piece will get us to the place where we have the political buy-in to get those policies. So I think they feed each other. And for me, that is to finally see care in all its breadth and all its fullness. You know, we had for so long this kind of sentimental fairy tale version of care, and then we had this kind of nightmare version of care. And to me, in a way, they all diminish care. And I would love to be in a culture that treats care stories with the same curiosity that it treats other stories. So let's say you're at a dinner party, and on one side of the table, there's a guy who just hiked Mount Everest. And on the other side of the table is a dad who just is on 6-month paternity leave and is the primary caregiver for a newborn, or someone caring for their parent with dementia. And my experience of humanity thus far tells me that if everyone kind of went around the table and did those quick intros, everyone would be like obsessed with Mount Everest guy and want to know everything. And that guy would be seen as someone who did something really challenging. It's not easy, right? We know it's challenging, but filled with like meaning, and it somehow would make him wise. And we would just want to hear about it because we assume that he understands something we don't understand or knows things we don't know. And I don't think the new dad or the adult child caring for a parent with dementia would be treated with the same curiosity and respect. And I am here to tell you, I've interviewed a lot of parents and caregivers like Mount Everest guy. They're also doing something challenging. They're also learning so much about what it means to be alive, what it means to be a human, about themselves. They're going through it. They're also on that hero's journey. So I want a culture change that gets us to the place where we hear that someone's in a moment of intense care and we look at them as someone from whom we can learn things and we respect. And again, I always go back to curiosity, because we don't just need economic justice and dignity for people who care. We also need that curiosity.
Yeah, and I think maybe a big part of that cultural shift starts with getting curious within ourselves about like what our own stories of care are, where they come from, like what society says about care, who told us these stories, and then like, are those true? Do we believe that to be true, or do we have a different narrative that we want to explore or we want to rewrite for ourselves? And doing that within ourselves can help shift that in the collective.
Absolutely. And I think it's hard. Like, you know, we don't arrive at care with any kind of framework. I think about, and you know, when I was doing my undergrad and I took all the 101s, right? Economics 101, philosophy 101. I was an English major, so I read all the great books, you know, like no one really mentions parenting or caregiving in any of those classes. It's this thing that's necessary for the survival of humanity. And it was just kind of left out of the human story as I was taught it as a like eager 18 or 19-year-old, right? I didn't hear about the economic might of care. I didn't hear about the fact that humans aren't all just these like independent, rational, theoretical beings in philosophy class. I didn't read any great books. You know, I read so many of, you know, quote unquote great novels from American and British, the American and British canon. None of them focused on someone going through the hero's journey that is care. Not a single one, right? So like we need to write those scripts for ourselves. Like now's the time. It's happening. There's more and more beautiful care stories entering popular culture. It's happening, but we need to write those scripts. We need to put care at the center of our understanding of self, and something that when we feel the hard parts, we understand that it's not just hard, that those struggles and those challenges are part of a much bigger story about ourselves and our lives.
Yes, I think you're so spot on with that. And as we think about those greater stories about care, I just want to reflect something a listener sent in about your framing of like questioning care as a spiritual practice, because I think that kind of helps to create a bit of that shift in the way we look at it. So here is one final clip.
Viewing parenthood as a spiritual practice is a really empowering way to go about it, and a really true way for me. But it's easy to get into the slog of like, I need to do this, logistics, like making sure we're going on the schedule, like separating tasks within a family to make sure that everyone's feeling balanced and supported. All of that's really important. But if you only do that, then there's such a disconnect from the like depth of what you really do get out of being a parent, which is, that depth of joy, that depth of intensity, like the full spectrum of human living, and being able to be present with each of those feelings and be like full of gratitude for the whole experience. Like all of that stuff I view as a spiritual practice, because like that's what it's all about, just feeling connected to the earth and to each other and to ourselves.
Does that relate to how it's been a spiritual practice for you at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the first thing it kind of brought to mind is there was so much talk, particularly actually when I was having Augie, my 12-year-old, like there were books and articles like, does parenting make you happier? That was the big debate. Like, are parents happier than non-parents? And to me, that just misses the whole point. Happiness is great. We want to be happy. I think, when you dig into the data, sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, depends on the person. The main thing we know is that in countries where parents are supported by policies, they're happier than countries where they are. But to me, it's not, happiness is not, and I'm not going to say it's nothing. We all want to be happy, right? But, happy enough. But what parenting really brings us is meaning and moments of joy, right? And I think that's where viewing it as a spiritual practice is a much better framework than viewing it as a like get happy scheme, right? It's like, will this make me happier? Like, yes and no and everything in between. If parenting was just making you happy, I don't think you're really parenting, because that's really not what difficult relationships do to us, right? And when I say difficult, I mean all real deep relationships. If you're really trying to connect with other human, there's probably going to be friction. I've never heard of an example, let's just say, where there was no friction and deep connection. But if someone's had it, please let me know. And I think that when we view it through that seeking lens, because when we're seekers, which I think a lot of us with any kind of spiritual practice, whether it's through a very traditional religion with its own set of bound rituals and rules, or as someone who enters the spiritual plane through their own version of sacred practices and in their own kind of communities, either one, we're showing up as seekers. We're showing up from a place of humility. I think that's what gets us out there, so to speak, on the field, of this kind of spiritual seeking is humility, awe, curiosity, vulnerability, fear, right? These are the kind of feelings we generally bring to any kind of spiritual or religious practice. And those are the feelings that come out of parenting as well. And and we're in that kind of seeking mindset, we see the vulnerability, we see the fear, we see the humility, the not knowing, the receptivity for awe as really good things, because we know that's an honest spiritual practice, right? You show up knowing everything. I mean, I don't think you're doing much digging and seeking if you already know it all, right? And you're just confirming what you know. Like it's you have to feel a little off balance, and it's that same off balanceness that you do get from parenting that can take you somewhere else if you're willing to allow it, if you're willing to be in that place again of vulnerability, not knowing, and ask yourself these questions, ask questions about life itself, and view the experience as fodder for those questions and not the answer to those questions.
Yeah, and maybe that ties back to that beginning of like getting lost in motherhood and in parenthood. You know, it can become a part of that mystery and a part of the beauty of that spiritual process of what it means to care. And hopefully the more that we learn to care and to value care, you know, with our most intimate relationships, the more that can weave out into our communities and our society and like make its way to policy and making the changes that need to be happening so that we can care for one another in our communities, especially right now. Elissa, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us on all of these things today. For those listening, how can we support you? How can we support your work? How can we support care in our communities?
I think to start with me, if you're care curious, I definitely recommend my book, When You Care, The Unexpected Magic of Caring for Others, in which I really try to reinsert care in the center of the human story, where it belongs and where it was denied a space by the patriarchy. On top of that, I have a Substack called Made with Care. I'm on Instagram at Elissa Avery, where I post all my freelance work. I had a piece in The Atlantic a couple weeks ago about the philosophy of parenting, for example. Then to jump to the community piece, I will do a quick and direct request and call for donations to an organization called Caring Across Generations, which really inspired me by kind of naming this thing called care and acknowledging that while caring for children and caring for old, ill, or disabled people is very different in many ways, there's still something to this care thing. And when we organize through the lens of care, we're more likely to get the kind of policies that we need to make meaningful difference in parents and caregivers' lives. So once again, Caring Across Generations. Follow them on socials. If you're able to donate. They hustled their tushes off to get a care agenda into this election. They fought for Kamala, who they thought would be most likely to deliver the care agenda. And I can promise you their work's not ending. And then I just want to remind everyone, because I think there's a lot of pressure, particularly on moms, that feel like they because they're so busy with their kids, now they're not good activists anymore, right? They're not really fighting for change. And I just want to remind us that raising good kids is political. Raising kids that know how to be honest and respectful of others is political. Raising kids who can be in a classroom with kids that are different than them and have curiosity instead of fear, that's political, right? So just showing up for your kids is political. Caring for your friends, maybe there are other parents who are feeling stressed out sometimes, but also just caring for people in your life is also a huge piece of our collective of like civic engagement, right? So I don't want to say that it's political in the like kind of that you're when you're caring for your kids, it makes you a Democrat or Republican, or right? It's not partisan, but it's an investment in the collective. Every act of care is an investment in the collective. And without the collective, without that sense of connection and trust, like democracies die. You know, that is, you know, I'm trying to remind everyone today, like if you're caring for yourself, if you're caring for others, if you're caring for your kids, you're investing in care, like you're moving the needle in the right direction.
I know I needed to hear that today. Thank you again so much for your time. And just sidebar, I know my mind was spacey today, so thank you for following my conversation when my mind took its moments.
You know, it feels good to connect.
It does.
I think it's kind of a living example of like, if we can talk about care and just, you know, it's like every time we utter the words, we're summoning a little bit into existence, a world in which care matters. We need to keep talking, you know, it's like we cannot stop, so.
Yeah, and I think especially today, I'm like, I need to be just getting more involved in figuring out the things. So this is kind of a grateful thing to have. Like, okay, here's something I can put energy towards and focus on and get involved with. Really appreciate you. Really appreciate your work. Love your book.
Thank
I'm
you.
so grateful I got to talk to you.
No, this was a real joy. I really, really appreciated the conversation and the framing and the kind of sensitivity and openness and lack of judgment that these are big questions, big decisions. So I really appreciated it.
Have a good rest of your day.
All right, take care.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to How the Wise One Grows today. This podcast is supported 100% by our listeners, and you can help support it and keep it going by doing a couple of really quick things today. 1, follow the podcast on your favorite streaming platform. This makes sure that you never miss an episode, and it helps talk to the podcast algorithm gods so that more people can find the pod. You can also share this podcast and an episode you love with a friend. You can leave a review, preferably a 5-star review on your favorite streaming platform. And you can join the Dream Team for as little as $3 a month to help financially support this podcast and all of the operating costs that go into making it possible. Your support means the world. Thank you for listening and having these conversations and being a part of our community. Until the next time, let's keep taking it one breath at a time.